Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, gats and kittens, comic book fans the world over, welcome to yet another thrill-packed, informative episode of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me, a world-renowned, world-celebrated, world-famous, just legend in my own mind, comic book writer, Chuck Dixon. You get to ask me what I do, about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. And let's not waste one more second of your precious time. And if you're driving, keep your eyes on the road. Okay. Kevin asks, I have a question and you may not know the answer. That is entirely possible. Is it math? Marvel made insane business investments in the 1990s. Why, oh why, did they not buy the presses at Sparta and attempt to get ownership of one of the magazine distributors? Controlling Sparta would have paid for itself. Money could have been made from other publishers. Instead, they bought a toy company while simultaneously abandoning young readers. As a knucklehead off the street, this appears nonsensical. Well, largely, all the decisions in the 1990s at Marvel happened because of Ron Perlman. No, not the guy from Sons of Anarchy and Hellboy. He was the CEO of Revlon. And he bought Marvel for, well, whatever reason, but mostly he bought Marvel because he saw it as a cash cow. He looked upon it much the same way the mob does when they lend money to a dry cleaning business and then in order to get their money back, destroy the business by borrowing money against it and making crazy investments and then going bankrupt. So Ron Perlman's endgame for Marvel was not the long-term survival of Marvel. He was only concerned with the short-term cash he could make. And so basically in this period, you had what amounted to a continuous fire sale of Marvel properties to licensors, TV and film rights, and all the rest of it. Which, this combined with the fire sale they held in the 80s is the basis, the reason why all of Marvel properties are not under one studio. Disney does not control everything, even though they bought the Marvel Universe. Some properties lie outside of their influence because of deals made in this period. And, he bought a toy company because it would be quick profit. There was a boom in action figures. Action figures were selling like crazy because of the success of G.I. Joe. And Marvel wanted to cash in, so he bought Toy Biz. He didn't buy a printing company, which he should have, because Marvel's entire history was plagued by the fact that they had no control over the presses and couldn't get on the presses in a lot of cases. And it really wasn't until the late 60s when World Press, opened a new press so that they could print more comics, that Marvel was able to expand its line. And remember, they had so many of their top tier characters combined into titles like Tales of Suspense and Strange Tales and Tales to Astonish. Once World Press expanded, Marvel was able to give all these characters their own titles, which I was a young kid in this period, was very excited by the fact there'd be a lot more Marvel comics. And then buying a magazine distributor would have made a whole lot of sense too, because once again, Marvel's history was that it was plagued by distribution problems. Atlas, which was the company, which is what we called Marvel before Marvel, Atlas Comics, was doing gangbuster business until their distributor, which was the same company that distributed Dell Comics, dropped them. And Atlas had no choice, and Marvel eventually, but to go with another distributor, which was owned by National Periodical Publications, which was DC Comics. So DC Comics was distributing Marvel comics, and you can imagine how that went for Marvel. They were consigned to the back of the bus for the most part. But in this period, you know, there was also a bit of hubris at Marvel, and some of it was good hubris. Tom DeFalco once told me, he says, we're making so much money, there's so much money coming in on the comic book end that we can afford to take some risks. We can afford to publish books that don't make any money. And to his credit, he tried to expand the reach of comics into museum stores and things like that with their Civil War comic series, their series of comics on dinosaurs and things like that. Largely, these were failures, as far as I know. They didn't go on, they didn't continue, and they were never collected. So I assume that these projects were failures, but they were noble attempts to expand the market. Unfortunately, I could have told Tom, these museum people are jerks. I mean, they don't like comics, and they're going to resist you every step of the way. But I can't say Tom was naive for doing it, because I myself, a few years later, along with Gary Quapis, would publish a bunch of Civil War comics trying to get them into museum stores, and faced the same thing. That was my second attempt to get Civil War comics into museum stores, and it was all the same old story. Museums hate comics. The literati hate comics. There's no way around it. But the biggest mistake made in the 90s was, and that's probably why they didn't even consider buying World Press, is because Marvel was retreating from the newsstand. They were actively retreating from the newsstand. DC sort of started doing that, and DC went all in on the comic shops, all in on direct distribution, and Marvel followed. And so they didn't need World Press anymore, because they were largely printing the stuff up in Canada. They were printing on better paper. They weren't going back to World Press as for so many of their comics. And I don't believe the magazines were printed at World Press. I think they were printed somewhere else. And so they abandoned the newsstand, and the magazines play a part of that. A big profit maker for Marvel was those black and white magazines. They were very profitable. They sold well. They were popular. But when they retreated from the newsstand, they left that audience behind. They left the casual reader behind. And this is what happens when you aim at your core fan base, which is what direct distribution does. When you're doing direct sales to a comic book shop, you are aiming your product at your core fan base, not the larger casual readership, which would find comics at the newsstand and pick them up. You're also destroying your entry-level market, which was, you and me, probably the same way. You saw your first comic at a grocery store or a drugstore, spin rack at a 7-Eleven, and you got interested and fell in love. Kids can't do that now because they're simply not available. The distribution is, boutique niche market in comic shops. So when you shrink your audience, you shrink your sales over time. Now, at first, profits were great because comic shops were doing well. It was gangbusters. It was a gold rush for comics in the late 80s, early 90s. But I can tell you, and I've said this before, I know from my own royalty statements that no matter how well the comic shops were doing, the vast majority of my sales were still on the newsstand. Still people picking the comics up off the spin rack at the drugstore or 7-Eleven or wherever. And so basically what Perlman did was he just raped the company for cash. He was later kicked out by a bunch of other venture capitalists who had more of an interest in the future of the company, not necessarily as a publishing arm, but as an entertainment company. And that's how we get the MCU and everything else. The purchase by Disney took those guys away. They took those guys out of the picture. So now Marvel is run by, the lunatics at Disney who don't seem to ever learn anything from failure. What was the other thing I wanted to say? Was I had another point to make, and it's eluding me. Perhaps I will remember it later. But let's go on to the next question. I think you understand my position on Ron Perlman and his destruction of Marvel Comics. The thing I was going to say is that before Perlman, And before the arrival of the indifferent crowd at DC in the early 2000s, um, the comic book companies were run by people who had a vested interest in the survival of that comic book company. I mean, Stan Lee wanted to keep the comics alive. He liked the comics. He loved the people he worked with. He liked the characters, and he wanted to keep that alive, keep that brand alive. And his uncle, who owned Marty Goodman, who owned the whole Megillah, often threatened to shut down the comic end. But Stan fought for it. In the same way, over at the DC side, you had Jeanette Kahn, followed by Paul Levitz, and they were advocates for DC Comics. They jealously guarded their corner, even though the company belonged to Warner's. And they cared about, like Stan Lee, cared about the creators, cared about the characters, cared about the brand, wanted to see it go on. Jim Shooter as well, Tom DeFalco as well at Marvel. They wanted to see, these were lifers. They loved comics. They wanted to see this keep going. Something beyond themselves. They believed in something beyond profit. And by creating quality work, they generated profit. And people like Perlman and the indifferent crowd at DC, and then ultimately Disney come along, and they don't give a rat's behind about the continuing success of DC or Marvel Comics. They only see them as, they only want to mine licensing money out of them for merch and ancillary entertainment. So that was the big sea change in the comic book industry in the 90s leading into the early 2000s. Now on to Peter Bowl. Peter Bowl asks, I was looking forward to Horseman and wasn't disappointed. It was awesome and can't wait for Hector to suit up again. My question is about his suit. How was it made? Beginning of the book, Hector had a different suit. Then suddenly he had this Horseman suit. Is there a story on how it was made? I would love to know. Well, he had to leave Drescher, and so he shows up in Florist Park. He and his family immigrate to Texas, and he sets up business in Florist Park, but he wants to set up a new identity because when he leaves Drescher, he is on the run from all these people that were angry at him, and we can only assume we'll eventually catch up to him again. So he needs a new outfit. Now his outfit is largely off the rack, military surplus, the armor, and things like that. And he's done some modification, he's done some adapting. Now, of course, he didn't buy the helmet off the shelf, but in Horseman 2, we show that Hector is, in addition to being a military vet, is kind of handy with his hands. He's handy with tools, and he's a good welder, and he basically creates this helmet. And he's interested in 3D printing, things like that. So he can make all of this stuff, fashion much of this stuff himself. But in 2, we will see that he's going to get some help with that, outside help with arming himself and equipping himself and the rest of it. But I won't reveal any more about that. You'll see soon as Horseman 2 comes out. But yeah, largely he's been able to put this outfit together from catalogs. And then modifying bits and pieces to it as a talented craftsman. So it's not, and it is real armor. It's not just a costume, and protects him from some degree of bodily harm. But he's going to get pretty messed up in Horseman 2, despite that. Mark Charters, he asks, just a thought on Superman et al. Killing or not. Based on what you said about superhero atheists in the recent video, at least for me, the reason is simply not viewing the characters as either children's characters or indeed as characters at all, but from the perspective of what if this were real instead. Obviously, this kind of thinking is not compatible with Superman as a children's comic book character, but I don't think it's meant to be compatible. In much the same way, I rather doubt the action in your Levon Cade books belongs in children's comic. Should Superman et al. Change to suit my taste? No, for the same reason I don't think J.R. Tolkien's work should be updated for, quote, modern audiences. I think Batman is immoral for not killing the Joker, but I'm not the target audience. The only reason to listen to me is if what I'm saying matters to the target audience. Does it? I don't think so. Target audience is the problem here. First of all, no, I would not have Leo and Kate in a children's comic book, but the comic book medium can be for adults too, but just not these guys, just not the costume characters. I will say this again, though it breaks the heart of many adult fans, these are childhood wish fulfillment fantasies. If you're still reading them as an adult, there is nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I mean, if you're reading Winnie the Pooh as an adult and appreciating it in a new light, that's cool. That's fine with me. I mean, I think that's great. But, and I'm conscious of this. I'm conscious that I'm trying to write for the casual reader. I'm trying to write for my imaginary precocious 10-year-old. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that primarily my audience are adult comic book readers. So I'm trying to give everybody a little bit of everything. I'm trying to keep the story moving for the kids, give the super fans their Easter eggs, fan service, and giving the rest of us a story that is, doesn't pander, that is, intelligently written and plotted and makes sense, and all the rest of it with compelling characters. I'm trying to do all that and please, a broad universal audience. But these are childhood fantasy figures, wish fulfillment fantasy figures. What if I was Superman? What if I was the Hulk? And that's what kids are thinking rather than what if this was real. I think kids know it's not real. They're never going to be Spider-Man. But they can pretend and they can live vicariously. And we can do the same as adults. But Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, these characters should not kill. And yeah, it is immoral of Batman not to kill the Joker. In the end, it's not right. But again, back to target audience. Who is the target audience of comics today? It's largely an adult comic book reading public who've been reading these comics for decades. And I know that's most of the people listening to me right now. That's you. You've been reading comics for decades. You love them. I got nothing wrong with that. I'm a fan too. I've been reading comics since before I could read comics. I don't want to say how many years, how many decades I've been reading comics. But once upon a time, that wasn't the case. Once upon a time, kids read comics for a while and discovered girls or cars or boys, if that was the case, and they stopped reading comics. And then their little sister, little brother inherited their collection, their niece or their nephew, their son or their daughter, their grandchildren, would inherit that comic book collection, and a new group of readership would come out. I mean, this is why in children's book publishing, I always say the top 10 best-selling children's book authors, 6 of them are dead, because children's book audience overturns every few years. That means, Dr. Seuss and Little House on the Prairie and the Berenstain Bears, these are perennial favorites. They are evergreen because they always have new readers arriving to discover them for the first time. And comics used to be this way. But they stopped being this way when they began to concentrate on the direct market, when the focus was on the super fan, and eventually turning this, pop culture phenomenon called comics, which was widely read across the reading public, over the decades turned it into this niche, subgenre, boutique market for a very small clientele. And that's the problem, because when these things are around for decades and you're reading them for decades, you begin to either want the characters to grow up or grow up with you, or the stories to mature with you. You want an R-rated version of, this character or that character. But you have to realize that that's not right. That doesn't work. making these superhero characters, mean and nasty, or placing them in a real world context, it ruins them. I mean, you wouldn't want to see. I mean, God help me. I hope you wouldn't want to see an R-rated version of Charlie Brown, or Popeye the Sailor, or Bugs Bunny. And why? Because you recognize these are universal, G-rated properties. They're supposed to be, while they can be enjoyed by adults, are meant primarily to be enjoyed by children. And unfortunately, that's just not what comics are now. These characters are not primarily created to be enjoyed by children, and that's a pity, because it's one of the reasons the sales are shrinking, is because of this maturation of the material, this focusing on the adult reader, leaving the children behind, who, what have we lost? 2 generations of comic book readers, kids who are just not readily exposed to comics, and they wonder why manga is eating the lunch of the American comic book companies, because kids get to see manga and get to be interested in it and pick out their own, and a lot of manga is children friendly. And manga itself grows up with the kids, not the characters, but the genres. If you can start out as a kid reading, Pokemon or whatever, and then move up to the more teen friendly, all the way up to the adult manga. And it's not different versions of the same characters. You're moving on to different series, like Stan Lee used to promote in the 70s. He called it plateau marketing. Okay, we start them off with the Fantastic Four. We move them up to Savage Sword of Conan when they get older. So their tastes are maturing, and we have mature material for them, but we're not destroying our core characters by growing them up. R-rated Superman, R-rated Spider-Man, awful idea. Just a terrible idea. I don't know if I answered your question or not, or just went on a rant, but it is what it is. Hey, Ryan Wilson wants to know, do you plan on going to any conventions in the future? Heroes Con is a big con near me. I was wondering if you ever thought of going. I get invited all the time to Heroes Con, and I get invited to cons all the time. I must get 3 or 4 invitations a week to go all around the country to conventions. I just haven't done it. I stopped doing it before COVID, and certainly haven't done it since COVID. I've not been to a convention, show, anything like that. I've been busy writing, and I kind of got in the habit of just enjoying sitting in this room where I'm talking to you from, making stuff up, and spending weekends with my family. So, I'm a simple man with a simple life. Although I may, the Rippa people really want me to come to MegaCon, which they say, hey, it's only an hour and a half away from you. Yeah, okay. It's not. It's in Orlando. I'm in Tampa. Orlando. It's like getting on I-4 to go to Orlando sometimes is like driving into the time tunnel. Yes, theoretically, Tampa and Orlando are an hour and a half apart, but on a really bad day, and there's a lot of really bad days, it could take you 6 hours to get to Orlando from Tampa. But I told them I'm working out the logistics, and I think I might show up at MegaCon. I'll let you know. I'll let you know ahead of time. I don't want to keep people guessing. I certainly don't want to keep Rippa guessing. I've got to let them know so they can reserve me a room. So I'll be there at least 2 days, I think. But yeah, I don't do a lot of cons. There's just not a lot in it for me. And a lot of people, very nice people, they'll say, well, we'll pay all of your expenses. That's not the attraction it used to be. Hey, free meals and free hotel room in a town I've never visited before. Not the attraction it once was. So, as I say, very nice people. And then I know some people charge convention appearance fees. I just don't have the guts. I still don't charge for autographs. So I'm way behind the times on the money grabbing at conventions. But anyhow, you earned yourself a twin spin, sir. Okay, this question gave me pause. My second question is, do you still talk to anyone who works at the Big Two anymore? For example, I hear you and Mark Waid get mentioned a lot. Are you and Mark friends? Do you ever talk to one another or anyone else? Now, I still collaborate with people that I worked with at the Big Two, and I'm still in communication with a number of people. I mean, I still talk to the bat guys every once in a while. Scott Peterson and I will email back and forth. Jordan Gorfinkel and I have worked on projects together and speak quite often. Not as often as I like. I like those guys. I wish there was time just to spend yakking on the phone. And obviously, Sergio Cariello lives only 20 minutes away. We have lunch together sometimes. Again, not as often as I would like. And Graham Nolan and I, still collaborate quite a bit. We've been partners on a number of projects. But the question of Mark Wade, I don't think Mark and I were ever friends. I never had any animosity toward Mark, but Mark is a participant in gamesmanship, and the kind of schmoozing that I was never comfortable doing, and I think a number of times he tried to work his magic on me. Did you ever meet anybody who gives you really, really bad advice, but they seem concerned, and they give you really, really bad advice, and you learn later that bad advice was given to you on purpose? That they knew it was bad advice? That's kind of the game some people play in comics, but those games never work on me because, as my wife will attest, I'm almost entirely oblivious to most, human interaction. I'm a simple guy. I'm a surface guy. So the gamesmanship doesn't work on me. I don't get worked up about stuff. I don't get angry. I don't, I'm not going to say I'm not gullible, but I usually don't fall for stuff because sometimes I'm not really listening to what they're saying, or I'm just not participating. It's like when people say, I'm being bullied on the internet. Well, then get off the internet. The instant you get off the internet, you won't be being bullied anymore. So, go do something else. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say we were friends. We've known each other for a long time. I have no animosity toward Mark. There's this political aspect. We're on opposite sides of the political spectrum. But I never cared about that. I don't care if you're a Lenin quoting, Marxist crazy marching around in a Che Guevara shirt. If I want to work with you, I'll work with you. If you can meet a deadline, I don't care. Your thoughts are your own, your opinions are your own. But a lot of people don't see it that way. So no, Mark and I aren't exactly friends. I haven't talked to Mark in years. I used to really enjoy his work until he went full political. And apparently he doesn't write anymore because he's very disappointed in the most recent presidential election. At least that's what he's saying. So yeah, yeah, we were never friends. Maybe at some point I thought we were, but I'm sure Mark has disavowed me by now. Bob Bobbins, you often talk about a good story plainly told. Here's my question on writing. When writing, do you ever come up with a metaphor, a simile, an analogy, or even a turn of phrase that's too clever for your style or the story you are writing? This is a problem that arises when I'm writing. Not that I'm that is not intended as a humble brag. It generally drives me nuts. How do you deal with this? How do you know when the line has been crossed? This is a tough one. I always say that a writer needs to ask themselves a question all day long, which is there a better way to say this? But a question that's equally important is, do I have to say this? Or is this the place to say this? And there's a danger when writing of being too clever by half. You see this a lot in like really well-written movies where they will leave a dangling conversation. The characters will talk to each other in non sequiturs. They won't directly react to one another's dialogue, and they won't complete thoughts because either through their acting or whatever, or the context, the audience understands without being told. You don't want to, be clever for cleverness' sake. And you don't want to be silly like, wow, this is a great simile. I mean, Raymond Chandler would have loved would have been proud of this simile, but maybe it doesn't fit in the horror story you're writing or the Western you're writing. So, I mean, when I'm writing prose in particular, um, you know, my stuff is generally very spare. Uh, I don't go into a lot of description of places. I don't go into a lot of description of people. Because when you're writing prose, unlike comics where the artist is providing the visuals, when you're writing prose, the reader is providing visuals. And it's best to leave as much as possible up to the reader's imagination because they're going to establish locations, characters, things like that early on in the story. I mean, you can't on page 90 say, you know, he had blonde hair down to his shoulders when your reader was picturing him with a crew cut. You can't suddenly say your character was an African American when your reader thought they were Mexican. You know, I mean, and in the same way, you can't suddenly introduce, you know, your little bon mots and retorts and cleverness into a story where it didn't exist before. I use Chandler as an example. Chandler, you know, everything about Chandler is the cleverness in the writing. Phil Marlowe's first person narration and his use of simile and metaphor and things like that. And everything is about it in that way, so you expect it. But if Leo Cade was to suddenly start making witty remarks, it would come off as, well, what the hell's that? Also, sometimes you just want to leave things to the reader to decide. You don't want to finish the joke sometimes. You know, you don't want to point out that what you said is funny. You know, just restraint. You must show incredible restraint as a writer, and sometimes it hurts because it's like, wow, this would be really, boy, I would really show off how smart I am here by making this reference or whatever. But I'm not going to, and it takes discipline. It's like in most of my writing, most of my characters never make pop references. Leo Cade, he has no idea what's on TV. You know, he has no idea what's the movies. He doesn't know what the song everybody has on their playlist is now because he's just not aware and he doesn't make those references. On the contrary, I've Mary Cade, his daughter, sometimes makes oblique references to culture, but they're her own, and they tell you something about her. She'll make references to World War II history she's read or a Mickey Spillane novel she's read because her library, quote unquote library, is her Uncle Fern's paperback collection. And she's a voracious reader and she reads everything. So she makes some unusual cultural references, but it's part of her character. It's not there as a joke. It's not there to make the story seem more real or immediate or anything like that. It's to inform you about the character. So everything has to serve that purpose to move the story forward, inform the character. If it doesn't move the story forward or inform you more about the character, you need to jettison it. If it's just there to be funny or ironic or just to show off, you know, that you have a college education or you read the classics, no, you gotta get rid of that stuff unless there's a purpose to it. In the Woodhouse would constantly have in his Jeeves and Wooster stories, have Bertie Wooster make references because Bertie had somewhat of a classical education, and so you will make these throwaway references to biblical scripture or classics, and so often he gets them wrong, and Jeeves has to correct him. But that informs you about his character. It's not Woodhouse showing off his knowledge of the Roman emperors or Greek tragedies, or his knowledge of the Old Testament. It's him showing through Bertie that Bertie has this in his past, this classic English public school education, and he learned these things. He doesn't often understand the import of what he learned because he's Bertie Wooster, and almost every single time these references are made because they're funny, not in themselves, but because Bertie is saying them. They're funny in the context of the story, and in many ways help move the story along, if that makes any sense. an example I think of all the time when I'm writing, this is kind of odd, but I think of this all the time when the question comes up, should I say this? Should I write this? Is this dialogue okay the way it is? Or should I add this little clever something to it? I think about the 1968 Richard Nixon presidential campaign. And in that campaign, they went with one campaign slogan for the entire campaign. It was in TV ads, it was in print ads, and all it was now I'm drawing a blank. All it was this time, vote as if your whole world depended on it. And that was it. Now, they didn't say it does. They didn't put a pin in it. They didn't step on it. They left it up. It was a statement, but they left it as a question for the viewer or reader to think, about the importance of this election and how they had to. There were a lot of issues, very, very important issues, and not to take this vote lightly and everything else. And the implication being, because it was a Richard Nixon ad, that Richard Nixon is, the man for these troubled times. And but they left all that up to the voter. The campaign was rather brilliant, and he won on a landslide, so it must have worked. And that's it. I know it's odd, but it's an example I think of all the time of, hey, what was left unsaid? So there you go. Have you subscribed? Well, if you have, check and make sure you're still subscribed. There's funny business. If you haven't subscribed, please do. It helps grow the channel and get more listeners and more awesome questions from you folks. Jason Shepard asks, do you think Batman enjoys his job? Maybe it's because I grew up reading Silver and Bronze Age comics and watching Adam West. But I think being Batman would be totally awesome. You get to put on the coolest costumes in comics with lots of neat gadgets. Then you and your best friend jump in your rocket car and go beat up a clown. I feel like a lot of comics, not just Batman, focus on the grim and grit and forget how awesome it would be to have this job. Yeah, I don't think Batman, I think it is a job, the Batman. I don't think he enjoys it. I don't think he stops and says, man, how cool am I with my cool car, my cool cave, and all my money. And I always somehow come out victorious because there is that aspect of childhood trauma. I mean, this is a guy who, as a child, watched his parents being murdered, brutally murdered. So I don't think it's fun for him. I don't think Batman or Bruce Wayne really know how to have fun. I think they just want to walk into their house justified. They want to know, Batman wants to know he made a difference. And that's it, because, when you're in that moment, it's never as cool as it looks like from the outside. It's like, you look at a police officer, and he's got his cop car, and his cop gun, and his cop uniform, and generally he's in great shape, probably ex-military, and yeah, he's a cool guy. Definitely is a cool guy. But he doesn't think of himself that way. Maybe the first time he put on the uniform and the equipment belt, and he went out and thought, yeah, this is cool. I'm badass. And then he answers his first domestic disturbance call, and the bloom's off the rose. Now it's a job. It's a job, thank God, that men and women want to do. But it's a job, and it's a tough job. It's a dangerous job. And there's nothing fun about it. So I don't think, looking from the outside, all of this stuff looks really cool. I mean, look at James Bond's life. I mean, guy's miserable. For the most part. He drinks too much, he smokes too much. That's not a happy guy. He can't seem to commit to one woman. So, yeah, I don't think Batman thinks of his job as fun or thinks that it's cool or anything else. We on the outside live vicariously through him. We might share some of his trauma, but it's at a remove. So, I don't think he's a happy guy for the most part. Twin Spin, you earned it, and here it comes. Jason Shepard again with which version of Bruce Wayne is the best? Do-gooder philanthropist, lightweight playboy, alpha male, business titan. Kind of a mix of all three of those. Bruce Wayne in civilian guise is a creation of Bruce Wayne, the Batman guy. It's a facade, but it's not. When I wrote it, I never played it like he was Don Diego in Zorro. I mean, Don Diego, Zorro's alter ego was just a fop, and nobody took him seriously. He just seemed like a lightweight sissy. Bruce Wayne is not that. Bruce Wayne is kind of he's a feat in his persona, this persona that he's created. He's kind of effete and disaffected and disinterested. He's the idle rich. He's seemingly more concerned with his golf score than he is with how his corporations are doing. But we have to remember, he built those corporations. I mean, his dad was, yes, he was wealthy and he was a doctor, but Bruce Wayne built Wayne Tech, Wayne Enterprises, Wayne Co., whatever, all these companies. He become a multi-billionaire. But he had to do it by not appearing to be in charge. And I used to love writing the scenes with Bruce Wayne at board meetings and things like that, sort of, gently or obliquely maneuvering the board or maneuvering Lucius Fox to get the decisions that he wanted, without seeming at all interested in the goings on. I mean, they might be at a board meeting and the board is fighting with Lucius, and Bruce takes a side in the fight by just saying, I think I read in Fortune magazine, and he gives like a pinhead idiot's opinion of some economic trend that the table must recognize is actually a salient point, even though Bruce probably doesn't understand anything he just said. And they realize, oh yeah, we should do that. And that's my Bruce Wayne. That's my Bruce Wayne. He's also unflappable. He's cool because he's indifferent. Much like me, oblivious to gamesmanship. Like, he didn't get angry at J. Devlin Davenport when I was writing him, because J. Devlin Davenport would skunk him at golf or cheat at some game or whatever, do whatever he could to humiliate Bruce in public in front of his peers. Bruce doesn't lose it because he's just like, oh yeah, I don't care. Hey, yeah, that's funny. It's another day. I got a lot of money. What do I care? I got FU money out the wazoo. And so that's my version. Ideally, Bruce Wayne should be just as cool as Batman, but in an entirely different way. And as I've often said, if you can't write Bruce Wayne right, you can't write Batman right. And the same goes for actors. If you can't portray Bruce Wayne in a believable, effective way, you can't play Batman, because it just doesn't work. Because we know it's the same guy in both guises. Christopher Cohen, do you think the lone wolf and cub trope that so many film stories keep using is starting to overstay its welcome when it is applied in Western media? To explain where I'm coming from, it's been a trope in comics that has been used in Western comics over the past 30 plus years, starting with Marvel's early 90s Jack Monroe Nomad ongoing series, Cable with Hope Summers, in film with Aliens, Terminator 2, more recently with Logan, Mandalorian, The Witcher, and The Last of Us. I'm certainly not criticizing the original, as it is iconic, as are the film examples I mentioned, which when transplanted to our current era, which began with Leon the Professional, another good film, Man on Fire, and more recently, You Were Never Really Here, it requires a little bit too much suspension of disbelief. For example, an adult taking responsibility for an abandoned kid needing protection would likely fall afoul of the authorities or end up on a register, if you get my drift. Christopher continues, and this segment is called Tell Chuck Dixon, not Ask Chuck Dixon. Just joking, Chris. I kid because I love. And when Western comics do it, it is ham-fisted now. I find its manifestation in the golden age of superhero sidekicks, where it was turned into a cottage industry, fine, since untethered children were common during the Great Depression. Departments like Family and Children's Services didn't have the reach they have now. Your mileage may vary, but if you think some of what I suggest has merit, thoughts on how it might be revitalized for modern audiences. Yeah, Lone Wolf and Cub is a classic. I didn't see the manga for years. It wasn't really available in the United States until the 80s, late 80s. But I did see Shogun Assassin, which ran on cable, and so Shogun Assassin was an English language compilation of the first two Lone Wolf and Cub movies, which back then we called the Baby Cart movies. And Shogun Assassin had an enormous impact on me. I mean, I was a dad, and I had a son, young son, and it really impacted me. I really felt it. You know, this guy, he's doing what he thinks he has to do. He's taking his son along. Yes, he's putting his son at peril, but the presence of the son humanizes him very much so. I mean, there's some really in what amounts to a bloodthirsty, 6-movie samurai cycle. There's some really poignant moments between father and son that are unforgettable, and that's why we remember Lone Wolf and Cub. I mean, there's been tons of Shambara franchises in manga and on film and in anime, but this is the one we always remember. This is the one we always come back to, because there's something in it about that parental drive that's very, very strong. And what I like about it, and what I try to do in my own work, is that the little boy in Lone Wolf and Cub, his son, is never a boy hostage. Yes, he's in peril. Yes, he's in jeopardy, but he shares that jeopardy and peril with his dad. But you never get the sense, and especially in the later films, that the kid can't take care of himself. And it's never a child in jeopardy story. Now, it was a heavy influence on me when I wrote Winterworld. In Winterworld, Scully, apparently amoral, roamer in a post-apocalyptic world, adopts this young girl, Wynn, whom he takes along with him and protects and everything else. But again, she's nobody's sweetheart. She can take care of herself, but it humanizes Scully. It tells you everything you need to know about Scully's true nature. That he's not this grasping survivalist. There's something good about him. And coming back to it, with Levon Cade, my Levon Cade novels, he has a daughter, Mary. When I decided I wanted to do this vigilante justice thing, I said I don't want to do. I want to scratch that Punisher itch, but I got to have a guy who's human, especially in a prose novel. In comics, it's okay to have a guy who is just a man-stalking psychopath. That's fun. But in a series of prose novels, I wanted to show this guy had a reason to be. He had someone who cared about him, someone that he cared about, someone to go home to, and ultimately a goal. Now, again, Mary Cade is not the girl hostage. She's when backed in a corner as lethal as her dad, ultimately in the stories, and but as a dad myself, I just emotionally respond to these kind of stories, and I emotionally respond to them when writing them. And I think the success of Levon Cade is shared by Levon and Mary. That relationship, and it really makes the series what it is for the readers. And a lot of readers agree with me. I read the reviews, I hear from people, and they really like Mary Cade. And when she's not in the books, which she wasn't in the last book very much, they were disappointed. They wanted to read her story as well. Now, on the subject, this is a tangent, but why not? Yes, you're right that you could take on a kid's sidekick back in the 30s and 40s, because there were a lot of displaced children because of the Depression. There were a lot of kids that simply got adopted without any adoption papers or anything else. They were simply brought into families because they were orphans and needed care. This is before, there was no bureaucracy. There was a bureaucracy, but it was largely ignored because there were so many, the system was overwhelmed. But to say today that child services has this tremendous reach that's not accurate. If anything, the displaced children and missing children and disadvantaged children problem is even worse today than it was during the Great Depression. There's an estimated 300,000 children who came here as illegals who have fallen through the cracks of the system. They are vanished. They are gone. And if you ever read the statistics on your local county child services, you will be horrified at how many children who go into foster care and are never seen again. They disappear, literally disappear into the system, never to be seen again. And I'm talking hundreds of thousands of children gone. So if anything, it's worse than ever. And this is an issue I address in one of my Lee Von Cade novels, is the horrors of the foster care system. And it's, it's something, it's a terrible problem that no one wants to talk about. And I've talked to any number of adults who were part of this system and the awful things that happened to them. And it's still going on. And there's been nothing done to repair this. And it's a nightmare. So Leon the professional works because no one would have been looking for that girl. No one would have been looking for her. So, and same thing for the Joaquin Phoenix movie you mentioned, which is an awesome movie, by the way. You Were Never Here. No one's looking for these kids. So there you go. A little bit of a downer here at Ask Chuck Dixon, but I want to set you straight. Ace Mowick, do you have any other anecdotes about that radio show host who described how the variety and publishing went downhill after the 1940s? Yeah, Gene Shepard, longtime host of his own talk show on WOR in New York. Hour-long talk show, used to show up at 10 o'clock at night. So I was able to listen to it on our radio, living room radio, in suburban Philly. Even though it was broadcast out of New York. Of course, depending on weather. If the weather wasn't right, I couldn't get him at all, or I could only hear a little bit, or there was a ton of static. But some nights he came in clear as a bell. Anyway, I talked in an earlier video, in case you missed it, about how Shepard in the early 60s addressed the fact that the world of fiction, the world of prose fiction was shrinking down to a New York City point of view because all the publishers were headquartered in New York. And once upon a time, there were book publishers all over the country, believe it or not. But the publishing industry sort of consolidated to New York and only accepted the viewpoint of people from the Northeast. And so if you were writing from Chicago or the Deep South or the Far West, they had no interest in publishing you. And of course, today we see it's even worse with, people being denied assignments or denied publication because of race, gender, whatever. And he addressed this. And his show, if you go on radio, Internet Archives, the radio Internet Archives, there's hundreds and hundreds of Gene Shepard episodes available. And his show was amazing because it was no guests. It was an hour of him free-form talking. I don't think he even wrote anything down. I think he just spent the day thinking about what he might want to talk about, and sometimes would stop what he was talking about to talk about something else. He would discuss a movie he had seen the night before. He would tell stories about his childhood, and most people know him from the movie A Christmas Story. That was, written by him, and it was a compilation of a lot of his childhood memories growing up in Indiana. You talk about jobs he had before, really funny stories about being in the Army in World War II, and sometimes he would talk about political issues or some topical issue of the day, and then sometimes he would spend the entire hour playing the kazoo to blues records, old blues records. So you never knew when you tuned in where Shepard was going to land on anything or what you were going to hear. And he developed this really large audience of guys who are like 14, 15, 16, like I was when I was listening to him on the radio. And he had this massive audience outside of New York City. And but as far as anecdotes go, I described in the last video briefly, he rode with the Freedom Riders. He rode with a African-American church group on a bus down to Washington, D.C. for the big civil rights rally that, we know today as the I Had a Dream speech. Martin Luther King gave his I Had a Dream speech. And he rode with these people, and the next day when he got back, he spent an hour describing the events. It is available on Radio Internet Archive. It's an amazing account. It's from the ground. You'll hear him tell you about things you will never read in any book. You will never hear anything. He was just an eyewitness to history and an excellent journalist. I don't think he was ever a trained journalist, but in this case he is. He's giving you, a non-biased look into what that day was like, and in the end, it's quite inspiring. Another one that might be of interest to any of you who want to just casually tune into this guy is he spent an hour talking about the time he spent with the Beatles. He accompanied the Beatles on their tour of Australia as a reporter, just sort of went along with them and spent days with them, eating meals with them, talking to them, learning about their lives and everything else. And what he reports is, he's an adult man reporting on what was at the time a teen phenomenon. And his unbiased, just plain way of looking at it, and the things they said to him and the conversations they had and everything else, even if you're not a Beatles fan, it's fascinating because, once again, he's an eyewitness to history. And he's giving you a perspective that no one else could ever give you because they were in the room, and he doesn't have an opinion one way or the other about them. In the end, he likes them. He thinks they're really nice guys, and he appreciates, their earnestness and all the rest of it. But it's just absolutely fascinating. And generally, you got to pick and choose. But he just does some terrific stuff, and he can be very, very funny, or very, very serious. I mean, some of the episodes are rather depressing. He had a dim view of human nature. Let's just put it that way. But definitely worth a listen if you can find him on Radio Internet Archive. David Zwally, I'm curious. You've mentioned in the past that you've been on series where you were months ahead on issues you'd written for publishers. You ever created a mini-series or written a full year's worth of issues to completion before acquiring an artist to draw said series? Does having an artist make it easier to write? Do you find yourself writing with specific artists in mind, or tailor your writing to that artist once they've come on board? Yeah, I've used this example before about the importance of knowing who's going to be drawing something. My very first Western story I submitted to Savage Tales back in the day. I didn't know who was going to draw it, so I went into a lot of detail on, weaponry and saddlery and costuming and all the rest of it. I remember the first panel was, one of those title panels, and it was a bounty hunter leading a guy he had caught into a Mexican town. He's south of the border, and I went into a lot of detail about his dress, what kind of hat he had on, how his prisoner was tied onto a pack animal, the Mexican soldiers sitting in the shade of a cantina watching, and the details about their uniforms, and the detail about the street and all the rest of it, all this atmosphere and all that. And then Larry Hama called me and said he was giving the story to John Severin. Well, I could have saved myself a lot of time there, couldn't I? I could have just written two guys ride down the street, one of them's a prisoner, it's Mexico. Boom. Severin would have filled in all the rest. I'm sure he didn't need any help from me picturing in his mind an accurate portrayal of a sleepy Mexican border town or the characters therein. And, so, yeah, I mean, the subsequent stories I wrote for John Severin had much sparer panel descriptions because I didn't need to go into detail. The guy knew what he was doing. Someone like Joe Bennett, I mean, going into writing the stuff for Rippaverse, I knew it was going to be Joe, and I knew Joe was up for anything. He's just up for anything, any crazy, nutty thing I asked him to draw. Nearest comparison in my career would be, either Rodolfo DiMaggio, who would draw anything crazy I asked him to do, or Flynn Henry, who would really go nuts on stuff. so it's important. And the thing is that, you know, Joe, Rodolfo, Flint, they would inspire my story because I would know, you know, I picture in my mind, not never accurately, the stuff never comes out the way I see it in my head, but I could at least, I understood the range of their talent, what they like to draw, and then aim it at that. And that was true if I was working with Joe Kubert, working with Russ Heath, you know, or whatever. Um, I mean, an example going back to Savage Tales, one of my westerns was drawn by John Buscema. When I wrote it, I thought it was going to be John Sever. And I probably would have written it a little bit different. I probably would have tried to guide Mr. Buscema a little bit more on costuming and things like that. Uh, so, I mean, there's an example. Um, but sometimes you're right and you don't know who's going to be drawing it. And I did a lot of that. I broke in a lot of guys at DC. They would give me, oh, hey, this is his first professional comic story or his second or third professional comic story or his first story for DC. And we're trying them out with you on your script. And that's when you would learn that some artists have no idea how to read a script. I direct you to my last issue of Batman and the Outsiders, I think issue 10, as an example of an artist who had no idea how to read it or interpret a script. Um, and so, yeah, I broke in a lot of guys. So in that case, you have to be, like I said, throw in a lot of detail, basically write a director's screenplay, you know, trying to help them pick out camera angles and such like that. You know, close up here, medium here, low shot, high shot. You know, do a lot of that to try to guide them because you don't know who's going to be drawing it. You don't know how good at storytelling they are. You want to give them as much of a help as possible. Now, an unusual circumstance was when Scott Beatty and I were writing Robin Year One, and we didn't know who was going to draw it. You know, we had our wish list, and you know, sometimes you got these people, sometimes you didn't. I mean, my wish list, if I couldn't work with Graham at DC, it was Eduardo Barreto, always my go-to guy. So we didn't know who was going to be drawing it, so we wrote the first script, 48 pages, and then they told us, well, we found this guy, Spanish artist named Javier Pulido, and we're going to use him. And I said, well, can we see some of his artwork? So they sent us samples of what Javier could do. I immediately called Scott and said, we got to rewrite this issue. Not because we were disappointed in Javier or Javier wasn't a good choice, but because he was so damn good at storytelling. And I wanted to take advantage of that. He's really, really good at storytelling. And I said, we gotta trim dialogue. We gotta rethink some of these scenes. We gotta give this guy some room to show off his chops. You know, we gotta add panels to these pages, subtract panels from these pages. We gotta blow this scene up. We gotta condense this scene more. We gotta give this scene more breathing room. And mostly we gotta cut a lot of dialogue and cut a lot of narration and just let this guy go to town. Let this guy carry the ball for us on the visual storytelling. And I've never regretted that decision. So we rewrote the script tailored to Javier's prodigious talents. And I'm so glad we did, because the end product, Scott and I are to this day very, very proud of, and I'm certain Javier is as well. So another twin spin, The Creature Returns. David Zwiley again. If you ever tasked to write a mainline X-Men book like Uncanny, who would you want as your team of characters? I would leave comics before I would write an X-Men book. I'm not the X-Men guy. You don't want me writing an X-Men book. I would write an X-Men book that every X-Men fan hated. Not because I would rub their face in it or whatever. It's just I just don't have a feel for these characters. And I wouldn't write good stuff. So I would, no X-Men for me. I'm sorry. I can't even imagine a group that I would write of them because I don't care about them. Oh, sorry, X-Men fans. Everybody can't love everything. I mean, if you love X-Men, there was a period where I read X-Men and enjoyed it. Never wanted to write it, but I did enjoy the comics for what they were. And there you go, a triple spin. Triple spin. David Zwiley is back with, do you think that the Rippaverse will eventually include Western-themed books? Eric has expressed the Desire, Mr. July, that he's open to any genre. Because Joe and I have thrown some pretty crazy ideas at him, and he said yes to all of them. And some of them didn't seem like they'd even be really good fits at Rippa. Will he do a Western comic? I imagine they will someday. I imagine they'll touch on every genre. Eric has said that, you know, he wants to explore this universe and hit on everything. So I'm sure they would. Now, will I write a Western for Rippa? I don't think so, because I, you know, the Rippaverse has a certain tone that I'm fine with them on superheroes. I don't think I could match that tone in a Western, or would want to match it in a Western. And also, for my own selfish purposes, I write my own Westerns. So I've written 4 Westerns so far. I wrote 2 under A.W. Hart, a house name at Wolfpack Press. And then Snakehand and La Gringa, which are available from Castalia. Snakehand I co-wrote with John Neal. They're part of the Sidewinders series. And yes, I am 3/4 of the way through a 3rd Sidewinders book called Gallows. It'll be out sometime next year. And it's a genre I love. It's my favorite genre, but I'd rather create in my own. I'm writing a sort of a neo-Western right now. I've written it. It's being drawn now. Create our own project. I have another Western in mind that if I find the right artist, I've been looking for years to find the right artist for, that I'd love to do in comic form. And I always say, you know, my ultimate goal in life is to leave the internet behind, move to a cabin in the woods, and just write Westerns for the rest of my life. So yeah, it's a genre I like, but I don't picture myself doing it for the Rippaverse, for whatever. I could be persuaded, but I don't, you know, I don't think I would write the kind of Western they would want, if that makes any sense at all. And I'm just involved in my own Western projects, selfishly. One more thing. Some thoughts on thought balloons. It's weird because right after I put the visuals together for this, I got a posting on the email asking about thought balloons, my thoughts on thought balloons. But prior to that, it had come up in a discussion thread on Facebook, and a number of, you know, quite frankly, comic book legends chimed in to say they like thought balloons. They really like them and everything else. Now, thought balloons serve a purpose. Obviously, they give you the interior thoughts of any given character. It's a way to bring out emotion, exposition, the inner life, the life of the mind of these fictional characters. And when used well, it can be extremely effective. When used poorly, it can be a crutch. But, you know, how else are you, particularly with comic book superhero characters who are generally loners, how else are you going to reveal what they're feeling? Because they can't discuss it with anybody. I mean, that's like in The Sopranos, when Tony would visit the psychiatrist. It's a comic book. It's the film equivalent of a thought balloon. He would share his thoughts with someone, so we would know what he was thinking. We would know where he was emotionally, because he couldn't show weakness in front of everybody else. So thought balloons do serve a purpose. Now, my problem with the thread was, and I realize I'm being silly, I'm complaining about a Facebook thread on YouTube, but I'm doing it anyway. Somebody said that the reason why we didn't use thought balloons anymore was because of Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, where Miller eschewed thought balloons in place of narration captions. And I have a problem with that, because I've said this often before, is that Frank Miller never did anything that Joe Kubert didn't do first. Joe Kubert and Robert Kanigher in Sergeant Rock eschewed thought balloons for first-person narration. Sergeant Rock would literally tell you the story each issue. And he would tell you what was going on with the Easy Company and all the rest through a series of narration captions. Hold on, I wanted another thing here. And so you would get the inner life, the life of the mind of Sergeant Rock and what he was feeling and everything else through these captions. And, you know, and the idea that, you know, the Facebook poster said that the idea of using narration captions came from Frank Miller, and that's why we have things like, you know, war journal entries for the Punisher and things like that. Well, war journal entries for the Punisher predate Frank Miller's arrival in comics by, you know, a few years. In early appearances of the Punisher as a solo character, it was established that he kept a war journal. As Archie Goodwin wrote him in his special, I think Jerry Conway wrote one, and they would, you know, you don't want Frank Castle having thought balloons. That's ridiculous. It's antithetical to everything about Frank Castle that we are able to peer into his mind. We learn about Frank Castle by what he does and the sort of, you know, paradoxical, you know, clues that he gives us in the narration as to where he is mentally. And you know, prior to all of them, the Warren comics, Creepy, Eerie, Vampirella, which were largely influenced by the EC comics of the 1950s, they also issued thought balloons for narration captions. And as they moved into the 70s, heavily narration captioned. If you look at the work of like Doug Mensch in this period, he's practically writing, you know, novel-length entries in the narration. You know, very seldom did you see thought balloons. It must have been a policy at Warren because, you know, they wanted the stories more visually told, more cinematically told, and so they got rid of all that. And also, you know, largely in the 80s and 90s, creators moved away from thought balloons. In this instance, Mike Baron stopped using thought balloons unless he had his characters communicating telepathically. That makes sense, doesn't it? And myself, I never used thought balloons. I would use thought balloons occasionally as a humorous counterpoint, very much pointing out this is a thought balloon. Very, very rarely use thought balloons. I mean, hardly ever, almost never use thought balloons. And when I first started in comics, I was very much narration captions, very little dialogue, visual storytelling. You know, what I do today, the invisible hand writing of, you know, letting the reader learn about the characters through what they do rather than what they say, or God forbid, what they think. And that's it. That's my thoughts on thought balloons. So there, Facebook. Hey, if you need to contact me, you gotta reach me at Bruno Bookstore at brunobookstore@gmail.com. It is the best place to get a hold of me, brunobookstore@gmail.com, with your questions, suggestions, objections, you know, whatever it is you want to raise. And that's it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, subscribing, liking, or however you reacted. And I'll see all of you down the road.